stories developing out of the Middle East. One with 5 IDF soldiers reported wounded in mortar fire by Hamas and their gangsters out of Gaza. The 5 soldiers are part of an operation to seal another of the smuggling tunnels. That is alarming enough, but we move immediately to Syria, where the White House is confirming that the IAF, it's the Israeli Air Force, in these last hours, struck an arsenal of SA-8 missiles. I'll report that those are Russian-made, and the explanation so far for this strike is that the IDF, the Jerusalem government of Bibi Netanyahu, determined that these missiles were not for Syria, but were on their way to Hezbollah, the gangsters who live in Lebanon. So we have 2 threatening stories, and we welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis, a very good evening to you, and I plunge right into the story of the strike against the Russian missiles. The IAF has heretofore launched raids into Syria and heretofore worried about Hezbollah transshipment. Do you believe that this is a success to continue this pounding the Russian missiles, or does this evidence that we need a larger solution? Good evening to you, Dennis.
Good evening to you. Well, I think we have to look at what's going on in Syria. It's clear that the administration approach has focused very heavily on the chemical weapons as an objective that sort of stands pretty much on its own, and you can see the value of dismantling the Syrian chemical weapons at a time when the future of Syria at best is unknown. I would separate what the Israelis are doing from that. What the Israelis are doing is sending a message unmistakably that when they establish a red line, they act on it. The red line they've established in Syria is that they simply will not permit the transfer of advanced weapons to Hezbollah that could begin to change the balance that the Israelis face with Hezbollah, that could make it more difficult for Israel to control airspace over Lebanon, and that could in some ways create some cover for increasing steps that Hezbollah could take militarily at some point. So I think from an Israeli standpoint, they are simply not going to permit the transfer of any kind of weapons that could alter the balance that they face vis-a-vis Hezbollah in Lebanon. And what they're doing is saying, even if there's an effort to disguise it, even if there is an effort to hide it, the Israelis know what's going on, and they will act. And they will not be deterred, even if it looks like there is a Russian hand in this. And I think this is a message not only for the Syrians and Hezbollah and the Iranians, it's a message for the Russians as well.
So we have a situation, Dennis, where you have multiple conflicts, divided interests, where the United States seems, according to some, to be pulling back and looking to negotiate, as the New York Times reported Sunday in that article about Susan Rice's 3 priorities, the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, Syrian negotiations, Iran negotiations, all of which look illusionary right now. So can you separate what's happening in Syria from the conflict and the determination of what happens with Iran?
Well, I think at a certain level, obviously you can't, because the Iranians and Hezbollah are so heavily invested in Syria. I mean, every time there is any real change on the ground that tends to work in the favor of Bashar al-Assad, it's in no small part because Hezbollah represents the shock troops for any kind of assault. Basically, what you find in Syria is that the Syrian forces don't really engage on the ground. They let their superior firepower, meaning air and artillery and armor, do the work. And if it involves actually having to go in on the ground and try to uproot forces from the very dispersed opposition, they pretty much rely upon Hezbollah or the other Shia militias out of Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah and Al-Haq, all of which are financed, basically trained, armed by the Iranians. So they're completely invested in what's going on in Syria. And so whatever happens on the ground in Syria obviously has some impact on the Iranians. That said, if you in fact could get a deal on the Iranian nuclear issue, that would at least remove that as a shadow over the region. And I don't think it would affect what's going on the ground in Syria. But I would say the more we would be engaged in doing something beyond just dealing with the chemical weapon issue in Syria, the more I think the prospect of actually producing a deal on the Iranian nuclear program would go up. I say that because I think while they're at the table in no small part because they are feeling, I think, the economic squeeze, I still believe that the greatest prospect of producing a diplomatic outcome, an acceptable diplomatic outcome on the Iranian nuclear program is very much related to whether or not they believe we really will act militarily if diplomacy fails.
And the fact that we didn't do anything in Syria, we didn't use the military power that we were ready to, sent the reverse message.
I do believe that it has made it less likely that they think that we will act on the objective.
And Iran won't let Assad fall, right?
They've made it very clear that from their standpoint, they're prepared to pay whatever price it takes to keep him in power. Now, it doesn't mean at some point, they couldn't change their position if they thought that it was going to serve their interests. But they've made a basic judgment that keeping him in power, or at least ensuring that there is an enclave that connects to Lebanon with him in power, that ensures their connection to be able to transfer weapons to Hezbollah, that they clearly view as a vital strategic interest. I mean, there's one other point I'd like to make here, which I don't think people have understood. For a long time, there was an assumption on the part of many, and I have to say that I was prepared to share it, that Hezbollah was obviously very much a proxy of of Iran, but Hezbollah was also a group that had its own separate interests within Lebanon. And I've come to the conclusion that basically whatever interests that Hezbollah has in Lebanon are secondary to whatever it is that Iran tells Hezbollah to do. And the reason I say that is it is profoundly unpopular in Lebanon for Hezbollah to be doing what they're doing in Syria. For some period of time, as you know, they sought to hide what they were doing in Syria. It got to the point where that was not something that could be hidden because of the casualties they were taking, and so they became very public about it. Now, it's not just that this alienates the Sunnis in Lebanon, it's not popular with their own Shia base within Lebanon, notwithstanding the fact that they pay a price for it with their own base in Lebanon. They're doing it effectively because the Iranians have insisted. Now, if that's the case, what it tells you is if we or the Israelis were to hit the Iranian nuclear program, if there's going to be retaliation by Hezbollah, it'll be determined, the scope of it will be determined not by Hezbollah, but by the Iranians.
Ambassador Dennis Ross is the Washington Institute Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Counselor for the Institute 2001 to 2009. He served President Obama as the National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, that's the Middle East. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.